everybody, welcome
Hey.
to another episode of Outside Looking In, the podcast series wherein myself, Samson Folk, I talk to 29, it won't end up being 29, not finishing the series, my apologies, 29 other people about their team, about the Raptors, so that you, the listener, can get a consensus of what people from outside of the market think about your team. You can validate some things, you can get angry at others, and so that you can slowly, by listening to every episode, learn about the league at large. Today, Seerat Sohi, based out of Los Angeles, but a Canadian woman. Here we are talking hoops, and we're talking about the Clippers today. Seerat, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
CEO of X,
CEO of
big
X, yeah.
promotion.
Yeah, I think this was just a platform that I wanted to announce it on.
Mm-hmm.
It just felt right. It just felt right. And, I don't know if you guys saw it yesterday, but a bunch of people on X actually reported that Elon Musk has tragically, unfortunately died. And they just thought I was the right person to step up. And it's going to be a challenge, but I feel like I got a good team around me. And I'm excited to see what we do from here. And if
I
you have any
read your writing.
suggestions, if the listeners have any suggestions, I'm very very open to hearing what they have to say. I
Certainly.
assume they're mostly be compliments.
Yeah.
Such a incredible, well run platform, especially in the last 6 months. Like a lot of the changes that they made have been just so focused towards what people have been asking of Twitter. I mean X. So
I think
yeah.
it's really cool that they're removing the info from the clickable links so that a
Hmm.
scammy ad picture will present the same as, like, let's say a column from a journalist or something like that.
No, I think it's really
Really
smart.
great.
Yeah, it's really smart. We just like to provide as much misdirection as we
Yeah,
can. You know.
good.
Hmm.
That's great. Um,
Yeah,
very excited for where they obviously read some of your writing and thought she can tell the story of this brand, and I'm
exactly.
excited to see what you conjure up.
Hmm.
What I'm actually really excited for, though, truthfully, is to hear your thoughts on the Raptors. Before we get into any of the Clippers, I'm sure you saw some aggregation of Raptors Media Day.
Hmm.
You've been around the team. You understand the bones of the team. You've talked to people within the organization, some of the players. I'm curious what you think of the Raptors heading into this season.
I don't. I don't. So you say all these things, and I need somebody to explain to me what has happened between the last time I really covered the team was probably like right pre-pandemic before I moved to LA. And oh my God, are things different? Like there are moves that I don't understand from from knowing some of the people in that front office. Um, I still don't feel like there has been a sufficient explanation for what happened culturally last year. This was a team that if I felt like they really liked each other. It felt like the Tampa season aside, and you can understand logistically why that would be difficult for pretty much everybody involved. But yeah, no, I love that you tried to give me some authority, but man, I haven't a clue. I just don't understand. I don't understand, but I imagine that's probably how a lot of fans feel as well.
I think you gave the what you just said. That is a direct rip from Jakob within his first 2 weeks of coming back to Toronto. What has happened here? What? How did it change so much? A
Mhm.
lot of these guys are the same guys. What's going on? That Jakob had a reaction similar to that. It is interesting, and to understand the machinations of, like, how culture changes. There's big motivators at the top usually, and then it trickles down. And there's a few different motivators that could be, in ownership, that could be in decision makers, and then obviously on the court, as far as affecting gameplay, a lot of people, a lot of fans will say Fred. Some people might think it's Fred. Some people might think it's Fred, Nick. Some people might think it's Fred, Nick, Pascal. But the truth of it is, it's hard to ascribe any meaning to any, because it's just conjecture. It's like you're throwing something at the wall and seeing if it sticks. Masai coming out and saying there will be no selfishness this season. I mean, he hopes so, but it was meaningful that Pascal came out right away, was asked about selfishness, and said it's too early to tell. I think Pascal's is the truthful answer. How could you possibly know? And hopefully training camp is going well. We have our guy Tim W out there covering it with Raptors Republic in Burnaby. excited to talk with him at the end of it. But
Mhm.
it is a confusing vibe. It's a confusing roster construction. But within that, do you think that there's a meaningful team that could make like a jump to the playoffs this upcoming season? How confident are you in that?
So one thing that I've heard coming out of training camp is just the idea of the amount of new sort of ideas, terminology that Darko has brought. And I can't remember who said it, but the quote was basically that like this, we haven't had a shakeup like this in 10 years, and you start to realize how necessary it
Hmm.
was. Oh, I
Jama
think it was Jama. It was
Moralela.
Jama.
Yeah,
Yeah, it
yeah,
was Jama who said that. And that struck me as really interesting because if you think about the Nick Nurse hiring, he was Dwayne Casey's top assistant, and he kind of was the offensive coordinator who then kind of like built more of a reputation for his really creative out of the box defensive schemes. But they weren't going to change terminology and change who they were too much, and not that they even necessarily needed to. Like, they needed a pivot away from Casey when they hired Nurse, and that worked for a season. I'm curious to see how it kind of works in Philadelphia too. He's kind of inheriting a similar situation there, granted with a much more unhappy superstar, a much more uncooperative superstar than Kawhi Leonard ever was. But that's a different story. But yeah, like I never really considered how much continuity there was in the entire Masai Ujiri tenure because they hired an assistant coach that, when he left, he was like, yeah, like, I've been here a decade. So sometimes you do just need to shake things up. But I'm also kind of the opinion that, like, this team has been kind of saying this for a really long time. And I think there's almost, if you look back at the Masai tenure and you add the new context of how they've handled things, I think it'll actually kind of bear out that he's not quite like the risk taking, swashbuckling GM that he kind of developed a reputation as, especially when he traded for Kawhi. Like, for the most part, this has been a team that's made a lot of incremental moves. Like, this is not the Kyle Lowry used to always be on the trade block. DeMar DeRozan used to always be on the trade block. You never really knew if Dwayne Casey was coming back, right? Um, and up until the Kawhi trade, like nothing really major happened. Like, this was a team that was like, let's go get like the PJ Tuckers of the world and see if we can make a difference. And it feels like that's kind of bearing itself out now too. And they obviously like completely botched the Fred situation, which I frankly don't understand. It's just like KYP. Like you can kind of, I don't know, maybe it's like a matter of Houston obviously changed their priorities when Ime came on board, and we know now that he had a conversation with James Harden about wanting to win the scoring title. That probably made them prioritize Fred a little bit more. But you also kind of have to plan for the board shifting a little bit too. So they don't trade Fred. Dame gets dealt, and like feels like maybe there wasn't ever like a really good deal there. So it feels like maybe Dame didn't really want to go to Toronto. So I see why you don't give up a lot of assets for him. You also hear that they want to get younger, but that makes me go back to like the trade deadline and like the times that you could have sent OG Anunoby somewhere for a level of like draft value that I don't think you're ever going to get again.
yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this is honestly a team that is like kind of falls in love with their guys. Um, it paid off with the Kawhi situation. They just they upgraded a position. They won a championship. Now it feels
Nice little
like
move. Tidy piece of
good,
business.
yeah, good trade. That worked out. But yeah, I mean, now that now that Dame's been out, and also like to Milwaukee of all places, um, the Giannis thing, we don't really know how that'll shake out. But there's like everyone's gonna want Giannis, so that can't be like something that you really bank on. I don't know. I still feel like I give him like another year and see you know what other unhappy superstars sort of develop from there. But I don't know. Like I am a little, I'm simultaneously confused, but also kind of looking back at the whole tenure and realizing like maybe we didn't like correctly characterize these guys. Like they're a lot more incremental in their approach than we necessarily thought they were, which doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It just
Yeah.
there have been a lot of mistakes in the last 2 years.
The incremental successes the wins they had also were a product of guys and girls who ended up leaving the organization. They had brain drain
Mhm.
on the developmental
They
side,
did.
in the
Mhm.
basketball ops side, and that's meaningful. That a lot of their increment, like the Raptors' success, we talked about Nick Nurse being an offensive coordinator. Turns out nobody was the offensive coordinator except for Kyle Lowry, and the moment he wasn't there anymore, they
Mhm.
couldn't curate like a good half court offense ever again. It's easy to, I guess, when you have Kyle Lowry organizing live on the floor to build an offense, and difficult without it. The Raptors
Mhm.
had trouble, and their developmental wins were the incremental moves that returned a lot of stuff. So if OG Anunoby and Norman Powell don't end up becoming like big wins, then the trade for Grievous for a first round pick and then a second, which became OG and Norm, like if you don't have the developmental chops, we're not talking about that trade really. It's just lost to history.
Mhm.
Same with like Jakob Bargnani becomes like a ninth overall pick. That's like just an incredible trade to get that off. I can't believe the Knicks did that, but the developmental stuff is really important. Fred, Pascal, these are incremental moves because they
Mhm.
aren't like lottery picks who they put in there and it's huge returns. It's these guys slowly made their way up through the organization and found themselves like playing big minutes, and
Mhm.
that's why they were able to sustain winning after Kawhi left. And the end of roster moves, the final four slots have not been as viable over the past 3-4 years as they were for the seven prior.
Mhm.
That's what makes it, I guess, a little bit harder to justify the lack of big moves, is because the incremental stuff hasn't been working out. And
Yeah.
I guess we can switch gears to a team that is defined by big
Mhm.
moves, the
I'd say
Clippers.
one more thing on the Raptors
Yeah,
point. And when you talk about selfishness, I think there's also a matter of kind of needing to assess why that came up as well. Like, there's the on-court side of it where you have a team that doesn't have enough shooting, it doesn't have enough playmaking. The shooting part maybe was maybe Grady Dick solves that partially, right? We still don't have a Gary Trent extension, which why? But
I think
we
so.
can.
They're
Mhm.
talking to Gary,
Mhm.
they're talking to OG, they're not talking to Pascal. OG isn't going
I,
to take it because he's going to
mhm.
make more money. Like his
Mhm.
his range for the extension just doesn't cover what he's going to make. So he's going
Uh-huh.
to free agency. They can still offer him the most because of, it's the incumbent team. Gary, I don't know what that's going to look like. His range is tough. And Pascal, they're just not offering. So, which is odd, but yeah,
Mhm. Yeah,
expirings are
but
not
like,
good.
yeah, I mean, like, yeah, that brings me to the next thing where it's like, okay, like, let's then think about the off-court reasons that selfishness happens. It's usually a byproduct of fear or a lack of security. And now you're going into a season where you got a bunch of guys who don't really know what's going to be going on with them, coming off a season where a lot of them were in trade rumors. And granted, that's part of the business, but like, you have to expect that that's going to impact things. You had Scotty Barnes with like all the pressure in the world on him, and he clearly wasn't prepared for it. And on top of that, you had Fred VanVleet going into a free agent year, and Scotty's talking about how he's the point guard, and then you watch these games, and it's like, oh, Fred doesn't want to pass to Scotty. And like, yeah, like as a fan and as a GM, I imagine that's disappointing, but like, you can't just like point the finger at that and not assess the root causes of why that might be happening, especially when it comes to Siakam. Like, this I just don't get at all. He is like he is like the banner headline for what Raptors basketball has been about in the positive way. International player, incremental success. Maybe you're trying to light a fire under his ass, but he's not necessarily historically been a guy where you even need to do that. He has improved on his own. He's incredibly self motivated and has gotten better almost every year, aside from like the first sort of turn into stardom. And like, he had a difficult time in Tampa, but other than that, he's just always gotten better. And I don't know why, as a team that has had a hard time retaining free agents, you just wouldn't want to lock up like Pascal. Like, he's incredible. He's great for your culture too. He's a good guy. He's like in his late 20s, but he also just doesn't have a lot of NBA mileage. I think he's going to continue to get better. I don't know. I just don't get it. I don't get it, and it would not be surprising to me if they went into the next season and had similar problems.
Yeah. Well, the big thing with Pascal too is I don't know what metric I understand. I did a podcast. People may have heard this before this comes out with Joe Wolfond, where we were kind of talking about the lip service paid to offensive changes, but the personnel also dictates that you will be doing things offensively that you were doing in the past. If you have like wings who don't shoot the three but can score in isolation, some of your offense is going to result in mismatch hunting. Just because Pascal ended up scoring a lot late in the clock and in the back half of the shot clock and doing it in isolation doesn't mean he's a selfish player or anything like that. He's a guy who has, as far as like miles run, positions played, roles told to be accepted, has just done it. It's just like
Also,
goes out
who
there.
else was gonna do it? Like, there's a reason that he ends up with the ball in his hands at the end of the shot clock going ISO.
Yeah, I watched all of Scotty's pick and roll possessions, and a lot of them he resets. Like Scotty will get the possession at the start of the clock, and Scotty doesn't get an edge around the screen, is facing an under or a switch, and resets the possession. That's an opportunity for Scotty that didn't turn into something. They've now been put into the back end of the shot clock, and somebody has to create. Like that is a very common thread across these Raptors is, the baton being passed to a guy with 11 seconds or less
Mhm.
left, and it's just kind of like, well, make something happen. And part of that is a product of a little bit of lazy offensive design by Nurse, I think, but also like when you don't have a ton of shooting, it's hard to make teams respect a lot of your off ball actions. It's hard to make teams move according to your motion off of dribble because they're like, we're just going to keep our shell and it's up to you to be a guy one on one because we're not going to shift for you. And it's like, I don't understand by what metric or understanding Pascal could be seen as a player who you don't just like hand the money to because
Mhm.
he's a maniacal worker. His teammates like him a lot, coaches like him a lot, and like, would it be? And even if he wasn't going to take the extension, from the front office's point of view, wouldn't you like to say we offered it? We would
Yeah.
love.
Even if you want to trade him, even if you want to trade him down the line, it's better to trade him once he's been paid. I mean, like Kyrie Irving got like a 2 plus. You know, like this is Pascal Siakam we're talking about. And by the way, I loved you, taking it to him on media day. By the way.
Well, I just wanted the answer because like I asked him about before, and
Hmm.
then he answered because it's tough to know what reporters are talking about sometimes, and I know people were upset. I muted the tweet after a little while about my preamble, but the reason why I preambled to that question is like I wanted very certain terms
Hmm.
why this wasn't happening, and like Masai, to his credit, let me do the follow up, and I just wanted to know like why wouldn't you re-sign Pascal, and to frame it that this is not common in the NBA to not offer that.
No, I
And
mean, good players don't go to free agency anymore. You go to 2024, like Pascal. I mean, we're going to talk about the Clippers. They could potentially have some free agents in 2024, depending on what happens. But Pascal right now is like projected to be the only star in free agency next year. Maybe James Harden, if you want to still call him a star, but
and
he's
then it's
going to be the
OG
most.
maybe too.
Yeah, and you have young teams with cap space. You have a Sixers team that is going to have cap space. We obviously don't know what's going to happen or what that team is going to look like yet, but right now they are projected to have max cap space after Harris's contract expires. You have Orlando, San Antonio, like teams that I think would like to have a Pascal Siakam or OG Anunoby type player.
The Thunder, big one
The
too.
Thunder, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's
So,
yeah, it's confusing. But yeah, let's
mm-hmm.
switch gears.
Sure.
Clippers, big move team. I'm I had a conversation with Jackson Frank about the 76ers and kind of how the Harden situation made it seem like for the first time in a long time the 76ers were probably not really in the contender situation anymore, no longer in that grouping. The Clippers, I think, this year, for the first time in a long time, people have kind of pushed them. All right, you're no longer in the contender status. Even last
Mm-hmm.
year, people were talking about They have Kawhi, they have Paul George. Look, they go
Mhm.
like 12 guys deep. Amir Coffey is the league's best 12th man, which he might be. But, like that kind of stuff I think is interesting. But where do you rank this team's ceiling? Do you still think
Mhm.
it sits up there?
They're so confusing because the first thing is health, right? If they're healthy, they have a lot of depth. They also have a lot of questions around that depth. Like I'm still like I don't think we'll know until probably November or December what their biggest hole is if they keep the roster as constructed, which is also a big question right now given the Harden rumors. And also like there's guys like Brogdon they could go and get too. Like is their biggest hole still that like playmaking one? Do they need that, or do they need to figure out what's going on at the four position now that like Marcus Morris really dropped off last year. Rocco fell out of the rotation. Batum requested to play less minutes last year, and he's coming off of playing in the FIBA World Cup, so I don't think he's going to be wanting to. Like he's not. If anything, like it'll be probably be more of that, if not less. So yeah, it's they have depth, but they have a lot of questions around that depth. They have interesting young players, but nobody is like crossed the threshold past interesting to be like rotationally relevant outside of Terrence Mann, who may or may not be on the roster, but also is a guy that could fill the one position or the four position or the three. And he's like you see why they're so reticent to give him up because he fills so many different holes for them. But like this is a team that I think when they are healthy they are incredibly dangerous. Um, we have just seen like it's just been like injury after injury. Kawhi goes down, PG goes down. We just get so few moments of the entire roster as constructed playing at the same time. So yeah, if you're in the boat where you're just like, okay, we're in year 4 of this Kawhi PG partnership, and every year injuries have taken them down, you have to price that in. Yeah, like I wouldn't necessarily bet on them to be in the NBA Finals or the Western Conference Finals because you do have to price that stuff in. That said, they're talented, and there's just a lot of questions.
I guess they're also small, you know?
Hmm.
Like once again, and a lot of teams are big now. The best teams in the league I find. Like the Warriors, they did manage to do it. They won with Kevon Looney and Draymond Green. But that team is built largely on shooting,
Hmm.
Curry being able to build out an offense with him, and Draymond is uncommonly good at filling the shoes, like the bigger shoes necessary for the front court positions. But otherwise, you look at the Raptors won; they were a massive team. The Lakers won, massive team.
Hmm.
Milwaukee, massive team. Denver, big team.
Hmm.
Big teams have been winning, and they also, of course, have to be able to battle it out against like smaller teams, and they have to have a lineup that they can go to, like the small ball lineup where Jeff Green is really important, for example, something like that, right? But the Clippers, it doesn't seem like they have that same level of dynamism switching between styles. They are locked into that. It's very like micro ball, 2019, wingy basketball. I think it's from a lot of people, they look at it as like a bygone era of the NBA style. But do you think that they can still succeed playing that way?
I think that they're a little bigger than they get credit for. Just because I mean, Zubac holds it down, and if you look back to the postseason, one of the reasons they were even in that series against the Suns is because of their offensive rebounding. Granted, the Suns are very small and also like were literally thin in their front court, right? So that's maybe if the Clippers go deeper in the playoffs, they run into a Lakers or like a Memphis team that has a Jaren Jackson, Steven Adams front court. They don't have that advantage anymore, but they're more so in the middle to me. The biggest thing to me is like they just don't have, like you said, that versatility to be able to go from big to small very easily because they have like it's the questions at the four, right? Like if Robert
There's a big
Covington.
drop off from Zubats to whoever else.
Yeah, I mean, they re-signed Plumlee, and I think Plumlee's really good for their playmaking. But yeah, it's not like he's not the most dynamic five man in the NBA. I don't think anybody would say that. But at the same time, I think the bigger thing is just like the front court in general around them. Like you just don't really know what you can get out of a player like Marcus Morris anymore, especially when PG and Kawhi are healthy. And I think you need to be constructing this team with the assumption that they're healthy. Otherwise, what's the point?
Yep.
He doesn't know what his role is anymore. Like he's kind of like an on ball creator, not the best mover off the ball. And he really dropped off in those areas through the course of the season last year. So they've got questions there. Does Rocco have anything left? Like hypothetically, he's the guy that should be plugging this hole and turning them into the type of team that can like, play him at the five, Kawhi at the four, Terrence Mann who plays a lot bigger than he is, Russell Westbrook who plays a lot bigger than he is. They should be able to have some of that variability, that like sort of like yin and yang that allows teams to play small while also, maintaining their rebounding and their defense and their physicality. But he fell out of favor in Ty Lue's rotation. And also, like, I don't know that I think he has a lot to prove. I think he probably has a huge chip on his shoulder. And this is kind of a year that's make or break for him in terms of like his future in the NBA. So we just have to see what happens with him. But yeah, I think you're right. I think like they are a little bit it's funny to call small ball old school at this point. But yeah, they're a little bit more old school in their construction and their style, when the stars are healthy, they play kind of that like Houston isolation, space the floor, PG and Kawhi take turns, not a lot of movement type of offense. But that's also something that I think they want to change as well. I think PG is a great cutter. He always has been. It's not necessarily something he goes to as much, but when they've been healthy and they've had Westbrook and like PG's been more of a secondary creator as opposed to like the primary creator role he was put into, he kind of does go back into that bag. I think Man is a really great cutter, but then like yeah, they're really stuck in this in between place, because I think if they had like a stretch five, then Terrence Mann could kind of be like what Bruce Brown was to a team like the
Sure.
Nets or the Nuggets. But they have Zoo in the middle, so it kind of, while they're spaced out, it kind of clogs up the lane a little bit, and they don't have the really, really elite playmaking that takes advantage of his rolling skills. Like I think there's probably a reason that he was really, really effective after Westbrook came, because Westbrook just put so much pressure on the rim. It really allows Zoo to take advantage on the glass. But yeah, they're like they're one or two pieces away from being optimized. Like you have a lot of talent, but they could go in so many different directions with it, because I don't think there is like an ideal conception of how this team should play.
Hmm. It's they're a very interesting team when you look at, because the bones of the team are the same. It's built on stars, obviously Paul George and Kawhi, and while they haven't had the health on their side, we've seen flashes of it. Like 2 years ago, the offense is really good.
Mhm.
And I think they were like second and third or second and fourth the first 2 years of PG and Kawhi basketball. And the defense was really good. Then they have their first like big time hardship year. No Kawhi. PG is in and out. And they find this like really mucky, upstart reputation under Ty Lue, where they have like a top 10 defense with a bunch of their really wingy guys and Zubac. They play big and they scrap on offense. And last year they just didn't really succeed at anything.
Mhm.
And like I think they were the bottom half of the league in both offense and defense. And it's like, how do you find the marriage of these different types of teams that they've been the past few years? And like, what does it look like? Do you want to play scrappy the way that
Mhm.
you did? And then also, how do you manage to get everybody working on offense while also integrating like a bunch of these scrappy defenders who it's a very wing led, they create like lots of turnovers. There's like this really collective idea of how you play, but then
Mhm.
if it's back to like that 1-2 Kawhi, Paul George, this is how we make things go. It's like, or even with Russell Westbrook in there, who isn't that level of star, but certainly uses a lot of possessions, creates a lot of looks for them. How do you get all this stuff to be cohesive? Because you can see in fits and starts that there's the bones of a really good team here.
Mhm.
It's just about having that kind of unite under one banner. I suppose, which I find confusing. Two confusing teams here.
Very, yes, very
Yeah.
confusing. Also, some similarities too, where you have a front office that they want to be a top five defense this year, and coaching staff and front office have basically said, yeah, we need more effort on that end. We essentially have not been trying, and then you kind of have stars like Paul George was kind of like, yeah, I feel like we try. Like it's kind of a similar sort of thing as like the Raptors dynamic. Um, but I think to your question of how do you cohere, right now I don't know that there's an answer to that because it's strange. Their lineup variability, while it can be really good at times, it also kind of prevents them from having a really clear identity in terms of how they play. Like if you look at the lineup data on their best lineups when healthy last year, if you had like you when like basically like when Kawhi, Paul George, and Zubac are on the floor together, they are deadly. They're
Yeah.
elite. Both ends, they're just like they're incredibly difficult to play against. But if you have Terrence Mann starting in those lineups, they're elite, but they play a lot more slowly. And it's more of like a offense is good, but the defense is elite. It's like man, you have man, Kawhi, and PG on the perimeter. Those guys just have so much like there's like very few players in the NBA that I look at and I say that they could not stop, because you have the
Hmm.
strength, you have the quickness, like you have like a lot of switchability, and then you have Zoo protecting the rim. You're just really really well covered. You throw Russ into that starting lineup, it's gangbusters, but it's very different. It's like high octane offense. The pace really really picks up. The defense drops, but it doesn't necessarily matter that much because like you have these three incredibly elite creators in the lineup, right? So it's just confusing. It's confusing. And then I think like even beyond the stars, you go and like looking at who is going to be able to fill the holes that they have. Norman Powell is a guy who's had to have like incredible variability in his role throughout the season. He was really awesome for them plugging the scoring hole in the playoffs, but there were parts of the regular season where he couldn't necessarily figure out where he fit in. And yeah, it's just like there's too many like playmate there's too many really like you kind of made the point of like Amir Coffey could be the best 12th man in the league. They have a lot of guys that I look at and I say like, yeah, to have that guy be your 12th man, that's really great. But at the same time, like I don't necessarily know what your top eight is, what your top nine is,
Hmm.
and from there it just becomes really hard to create consistency. And they haven't been able to. Like they've had a lot of injuries and they've had a lot of players where you're just not really sure where they fit in.
I think both these teams have a very clear, they have to figure out, and I don't mean to call players hodgepodge, but they have to figure out like the 12 guys to get to 10.
Hmm.
And then, if they get to that part of the season, they got to figure out the 10 to get to 8. And you look at the back end, and there's a lot of similar styles. There's a lot of guys who you've seen succeed for spurts,
Hmm.
but then they've also had like these devastating chasms in their game where just like they were completely unplayable and the coach didn't know how to utilize them. And they signed contracts with one role, had that switched, and aren't having as much success. Like that is the Clippers and the Raptors, the back
Hmm.
end of the roster, both of them. And they
Yeah.
both are relying on, they don't have elite guard stoppers, but they do have, really strong wings defensively and one big badass guy sitting under the rim. And so they'll have very similar approaches, I think, defensively. Is like how do you weaponize all these wings so that
Hmm.
you can kind of shrink the floor on defense, funnel to your big man, close up possessions and just push. But the difference obviously is that the Raptors are betting on a young star in Scotty and trusting in health. Obviously they just
Hmm.
need to see skill progression, whereas on offense the Clippers are fighting against health because they know the skill progression is there. Two of the most skilled wings ever in Kawhi and Paul George. So different variables, but
Hmm.
very similar approaches, oddly, I think, which
Yeah, yeah. And then you kind of have this strange situation right now, I think, in training camp where the Clippers want to get more movement heavy, but they're also looking to trade for James Harden, who is like,
Yeah.
the ball stoppiest player of all time. And if they do trade for him, then I imagine they'll go back to sort of that like isolation, everybody takes turns and spots like spots up for each other type of style too. And then you don't really necessarily know where that leaves Russell Westbrook. Does he become like the de facto six man on that team? How does he react to that? Like it's kind of talking about the James Harden stuff is really interesting because I think you almost have to like split it up into like there's like the 2K version of it, right? And in the 2K version of it, it's a no-brainer to trade for him. And yeah, you go ahead, you give up Terrence Mann. That's fine, right? But the guy's got a lot of quit in him. He's a flight risk. And you brought in Russ, who has been incredible for your culture, has really been motivating, got these guys to try their asses off during the playoffs. And you go into a training camp where you're talking about how one of the biggest issues you had on defense last year was effort. And it's like, well, okay, like I don't there's so many off-court variables with the James Harden situation that I almost feel like the themes that plagued them last year like might not be all that different than this year, whether or not they traded for him or not.
It would be really interesting too, is because it makes less sense than, because when he got traded to the Nets, it was just like, we are building this unholy, ungodly collection of stars.
Hmm.
And if Harden isn't playing through a hamstring thing, if Kyrie isn't injured, like that Nets team in 2021, they probably get it done. Health did not help them, but like, their Durant's toe on the
Hmm.
line is the big thing, but they had nothing go right for them in that playoff stretch, and they still almost did it. You understand why the Nets went after Harden the way they did, is like just this ungodly collection of talent. And it made so much sense with Philly as well too, because Philly has the big wings and the huge Embiid to insulate Harden's defense, and Harden didn't do bad defensively in Philly, but they did a lot to help carry him,
Hmm.
and it was a good place for him to play, and it made so much sense for him to pair with Embiid that, like, you're like, let's just do it. And Simmons was an unknown and still remains an unknown. It just made sense. You laid out the negative aspects of why Harden joining the Clippers. Like, there's a bunch of them. That, head to head, the 2K aspect of it, the trade aspect, it's like, we are winning the talent differential in this trade. But the fit is not as inherent as it was in Philly, and it's not as inherent as it was in Brooklyn. And he is even further mercurial now than he was back then. It's like you'd win on talent, but it doesn't make that much sense from a play style point of view, which is like, that's a tough decision to make as a front office, because you want to be able to collect talent. But
Hmm.
if the pieces don't make sense and don't fit, like, do you really push the button?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk through the on-court pieces aspect of it for a second.
Hmm.
Because, now that we're in this, I do wonder if maybe a Harden trade is sort of like the clarifying move that they need to decide who they are.
Sure.
Because then they're all older. And that type of stuff also helps you from a practice schedule lens, from like a load management lens. It's just, the Raptors, like for all the years that they've sort of straddled the line, they've kind of answered that question by having, a practice, then kind of having like a optional practice where it's all the young players, and it's not necessarily, it's more so it's optional for the vets, but the young players are there. So there's ways to get around stuff like that. But then, you look at how they'd probably want to play. They'd want to play slower. I think Kawhi and PG would be happy at this juncture of their career to play slower. You unlock Zubac too. He's never played with a playmaker like Harden. He's an incredible roller, and I think he could have a lot of gravity as well if he had like somebody throwing him lobs and setting him up the way that Harden can. And maybe PG goes back to sort of like the role he had in Oklahoma, where he was just like one of the deadliest spot up guys, and is kind of historically one of the deadliest spot up and movement shooters we've seen. Kawhi transitions to the four in a more natural way, and then you put Terrence Mann in there, and he'll be whatever you need him to be, right? Um, it could actually make a lot more sense on the court in a way that I think in Philly James Harden and Joel Embiid by the numbers are a really great fit. They are not an elite dynamic duo though. They don't enhance each other's games. They play different styles. They both sure like they'll both want to play slow, but Joel Embiid is not a pick and roll big man. That's not his game. And James Harden is not like a wait around while Joel Embiid posts up type of guy either. They both thrive around shooters. It's a good fit, but it's not a great fit because I think Harden thrives when the floor is open. That was like the key with everything in Houston. And part of the reason why he, I think, wanted to go back and like potentially win a scoring title, right? It almost feels like a supercharged version of the Houston teams where like instead, when you have Robert Covington still, but like instead of like Daniel House and PJ Tucker spacing the floor, you have Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, right? And Kawhi, I think, is a guy who can play on and off the ball. Same with Paul George. So I think that there are ways that on the court it could actually be really clarifying for them. It also would not hurt for them to, turn two or three contracts into one guy just because of how much depth that they have.
Sure.
But it's there's a lot of other questions.
Well, in the response, I guess, is like in the same way that you like the pick and roll between Harden and Embiid was unfathomably good, like a really great play. It's just you're like, well, is Embiid going to do this all the time, and is
Mhm.
Harden going to do this all the time? I think you run into similar problems with like having Kawhi, Paul George, Russ, and Harden. Is
Yeah,
that you're whose game is getting relegated, what aspects of it, and how do you get them to buy in collectively to make somebody else work, and like who is at the whose expense, who is paying, who's footing the bill for that, and you wonder like, does Harden still have the cachet to get guys to foot his bill? And that's maybe more so the question as far as fit, but I do
yeah.
really like that you bring up that's I didn't think about that at all, but it is like the supercharged Rockets. That's a great point. But in my head, I was like already I had moved Harden from that guy into like the pick and roll player that was like 22 and 11. But I mean, if he can just flip it back to like 30 points per game, I think I would really like watching that Clippers team. If it is,
Honestly, yeah,
I
yeah.
had a ton of fun watching Houston. That was one of my favorite teams. I know everybody hated the ISO stuff. I actually loved watching Houston, like, flatten
They're a
out,
pretty
get
fun team to watch.
yeah. I know people didn't like it, or people
Yeah,
complained about them a lot, but yeah, that would
they
be a cool
definitely had their
Clippers team.
moments where it was like a little bit too foul baity, but they were. I mean, like a lot of the times they played really fast.
Don't you
They
like
threw a
cook
lot,
his
like
ess ethos on offense? Like I thought that was
yeah, it's
awesome.
fun.
Yeah.
That's fun. I mean, if you like Luca, you like Hard.
People don't like Luka.
That's true. I mean, Luca has also become slower and more methodical in the ways that Harden has before, where he was a
Yeah.
lot more intuitive and magical when he was a rookie and in his second year. So I see the shift. It's a subtle shift, but it's definitely like a very clear aesthetic shift. So I get why people don't necessarily love watching either of those guys as much, but yeah, I do agree. It was a little. I think at times it was overplayed. I mean, like Harden can be pretty fun to watch at times, especially like if you put him next to players where it's not going to be the same thing over and over again. Like I think he could definitely be the 22 and 11 guy. He doesn't necessarily have to be the 30-point scorer for the Clippers, but I think it would just be more comfortable for him on a Clippers team than it was in Philadelphia. It's like as
Mhm.
much as the Embiid Joel, like and Embiid Harden pick and roll is always going to be incredible by the numbers. They're two MVPs, like they're two elite scorers. But like, do they complement each other the way that like a Jamal Murray and Nikola
Oh,
Jokic complement each other? The way that like a Dame and Giannis like have like the perfect yin and yang to like just bring out each other's best skills. Just that aspect of it is what I think is like missing in Philadelphia. And I think like honestly, if you want to win a championship and you want to go through the East, like those, I know they're marginal questions, but those marginal questions kind of matter.
I think
Like, what's
if
your
they
what's your pet action when in crunch time, right? I
yeah.
don't I don't know what Phillies is.
What do you think let's pretend Harden isn't on the team this year. What do you think the pet action for the Clippers will be this year? Like game 6, they got to get a
Mhm.
bucket. What are they running?
Ooh, okay, so like with the team as constructed right now.
Yep.
Man, I honestly like I still think like you just put the ball in Kawhi's hands and get to any spot he wants.
Do you
He's
like
like
Ghost
10 pounds
with Paul
stronger.
George? I think that would be like fun. You get Paul George in
Hmm.
motion. You make the point of attack defenders. Two guys make a same decision at once. I think like that would be what I would run.
Hmm.
Obviously, I think the defense like steps up. Maybe they make you force the ball to the corner, but then
That's
like
fine too. If you have shooters on the floor.
who who would you put in the strong side corner?
Man, I guess if you're starting Russ, like is Russ on the floor?
Yeah, let's say it's
Like you
like
need more shooters. You kind of need like you need more spacing. Like Batum is like an incredibly quick release. If it's like the last play of the game and you need a shot, like I'm gonna throw
Batum in the
Batum on
strong
the
side
floor.
is good. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that. Batum, yeah, Zubac maybe is closing, maybe isn't. That's where you get a little bit more flexible. But yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
like how
looking
much
at
time
it.
do you have the court? Do you have like, like 9 seconds? Can you get a shot
Norm,
off early and get like get something going and see if he cleans up the glass? Like is it a 3 point game? Is it a 2 point game? Like
yeah, I would.
that probably determines whether I have Zoo on the floor or not. Like, do I need offensive rebounding? If not, yeah, Norm.
I think yeah. What I would do is I would like Hmm. I'd put the ghosted screen, George coming off. If they
Hmm.
double up, if they blitz it, you just go to George and he can attack. I guess it would be a 4-on-3 at that point. I put Norm in the strong side corner so you can make that read. And if, they play the zone up on it or whatever, he can drive or dish. And then Zubac, I would want on the floor because if they collapse, Zubac can like curl around the dunker to the front of the
Hmm.
rim. And then there can be like a lay down there. That's what I would do.
Hmm.
And you
Hmm.
probably score a
I,
decent amount of possessions on that play.
yeah, I think that if it's just a one possession thing, you can also I think get Plumlee on the floor, and there's that making aspect of it too. Like maybe you put the ball in his hands. You know, PG can just he come off a pick and like he can backdoor cut you
Sure, they could
easy
run
if
split
you
action with
overplay.
Kawhi
And then
and Paul
yeah,
George.
yeah.
Fun little
I don't
duo.
know. I don't think they will. I just like they talk about being a movement heavy team. I just don't think it's going to happen. But there's options. They have a lot of options. Too many options. I feel like that's the thesis here. Too many
You're
options.
you're pro Harden trade then? You're like, hell yeah, let's go for it.
No, no, it's not 2K. It's not
Mm,
2K, man. I think like there's a Russ aspect of it too. Like, what do you do with Russell Westbrook? It'd be hilarious if they traded him to Philadelphia.
yeah.
They probably won't, but I mean, it's a great contract, right? Um, but Russ and James didn't get along, in Houston, and a lot of it was because they were like completely temperamentally different in terms of how they want a team to run. So is James Harden going to show up on a Clippers team and then be like, yeah, like it would be cool if we stayed in Miami an extra night? Because like the thing with the Clippers as constructed right now and what actually like made them a really good team towards the end of the year is not only the health, but the fact that like Russ was an energizing force and was really great for their culture. And I think they really like that because Kawhi, like in Toronto, just not a big talker, right? And PG's not a big talker either. Like Russell was able to take up so much emotional real estate on that team that they really needed. So you go and you replace that with James Harden, and I don't know. I have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions about what happens, and you're also running into a situation where you have like three stars going into free agency in 2024 and they're all aging, and one of them has proven to be very insecure in that situation. So at least Kawhi and PG, they have player options, but
Yeah.
James doesn't. And like, is it you also like maybe like another thing that I think probably makes them reticent to offer a lot? Do you consider James Harden to be a 1 year rental? I think you kind of have to. You have to just see how the year plays out. You can't trade for him and also assume like, oh, we're going to sign him to like a major extension.
Harden can really change, like drastically change the last like 4 or 5 years of his career based on how he approaches fitting. Like
Hmm.
two other players that for a long time didn't come close to passing him as far as like impact. But guys have finally started to do it. He's no longer like the preeminent give the guy the ball
Mhm.
guy in the league, and how he tries to shape his game. Paul George is a really good example of a guy who's one of the most dynamic players in the league, but will shape his game to other players. If
Mhm.
Harden ever like cares about doing that, he can be such a profoundly impactful player. I just wonder if it happens because
Yeah.
he's an unbelievable talent, even still.
Yeah. I mean, you saw it happen in ways with Philly that he didn't necessarily seem to fully believe in, which I think is kind of what it comes down to as
Yeah.
well. Because then I wonder if they have whatever team he's on going into the future. Let's say he agrees to take a lesser role. He sees the floor, sees what's going on. I feel like 3 game losing streak, 5 game losing streak. I don't know if that's going to hold. It's kind of like, I mean, it's kind of like how the Raptors were in the playoffs, like for 2 or 3 years before Kawhi, where like they were like this movement heavy team that was really embracing their 3 point shooting. And the second that they got blitzed by a playoff defense, like everything just reverted back to their old habits. And I could easily see that happening with Harden. It's just a matter of how much he believes in it.
That team,
He's
man.
kind of in the place that Russ was in.
Except better. You know, like
Better, yeah.
he's a better player, but
Hmm.
he doesn't have like the overwhelming like, wow, this guy's like the best guy I ever met. Like
Yeah.
all the testimony. I'm not saying Harden is a bad guy. People like Harden a lot. Yeah, it's been like a lot of teammates like Harden a lot.
Hmm.
But Russ, his testimonials are through the roof. Everybody's like, Russ changed my life. You know,
Yeah. Yeah, I did an article on him last year, like before the season started, and I could not like there was not a single person who would say anything bad about Russ, like even including Lakers people,
hmm
like despite how much of an albatross that situation had become, and like now you talk to people on the Clippers, and they love him, and he's just one of those guys who is so wildly different to the media and like where how he is front facing is just so
hmm
different than how he is behind the scenes. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I think also as you get older, that becomes a huge asset as well. Like that determines whether teams will want you around. Like, are you going to fit in? Are you going to be a positive presence? Or are you gonna, when you realize that you're not getting the same privileges and power that you were once afforded, is that gonna be an issue every single time that a little bit more is taken away from you? And I feel like with
privileges.
Harden, seems like it would be, like is Harden gonna walk into the Clippers like team and then like expect that he's in team meetings with Lawrence Frank and like being advised and like his opinion is being asked on all these decisions and stuff, especially when they already have a partnership with Kawhi Leonard and PG, and like on top of that you add the fact that like this is a team that rests. I mean, like I think Kawhi gets a bad rep for the load management stuff. He's been legitimately injured and like also like played in a back to
He
back
has
last
a
year. Like
degenerative
he's
knee injury.
yes, like this is not like if I think Kawhi Leonard would love to play more basketball than he has in the
hmm
last few years, but like Harden is a guy who has like gotten annoyed when people have rested because for all of the quit that he has in him, he also just has this love for playing basketball. Like he likes to play basketball. So that's another sort of differing factor in philosophy between the stars as well. And
Something
I don't know.
I wonder about. You talk about like these power dynamics, playing the politics. Maybe you, after your rise to CEO of Twitter, could give some advice about how
X.
to, sorry, X, to navigate these very difficult, sensitive situations. Um,
Yeah. I mean, we kind of had like a succession type of thing
right.
happening. It wasn't necessarily the most cooperative rise to the top. I can't
Do you
get
have a
into that
comp?
too much.
Do you
There's
have a
what's that?
do you have a succession
Yeah, like
comp?
modern day James Harden, just bulldozing. My father is a malignant presence. Like that's basically what James Harden said when he called Daryl Morey a liar, right? Like it was a lot like that. And it worked out for me. There's no maybe it'll work out for Harden. It seems like another day of Sixers training camp has passed, and he has not been a distraction quite yet. So we'll see how that goes. Maybe cooperation gets him what he wants. Maybe it'll be kind of like the Dame Lillard situation, where starts showing up playing ball, or like KD starts showing up and eventually gets a trade that he wants.
I think he knows that like he has a really great statistical resume, and he knows like keep juicing it. Like it would be very helpful for Harden to end up as like a top 10 scorer all time, a top 7 scorer all
Mhm.
time, like all that kind of stuff. I think there's some aspect of that. Um, and yeah, I just don't like, I don't know how he's never been able to say no to basketball. Like he just plays minutes, he plays possessions, he
Mhm.
just goes out there and hoops. For all the stuff off the court, he shows up like anything could happen in that extra day in Miami, but he's there
Mhm.
to start the game and he can still give you 40. Even to this day, like what did he score 46 in that one game in the playoffs?
Yeah.
Yeah. He can turn it on. I feel like
Yeah.
this we spent a lot of time on James Harden for a podcast about the the Clippers and the Raptors, but
Oh, it's fitting right now.
yeah, things are up in the air for both teams.
Mhm.
It should be interesting to see how it shakes out. Any parting shots you want to say to the listeners before we get out of here?
Yeah, I mean, like, fuck threads, first of all. No, I don't have anything. This was fun. I'm glad we got a chance to catch up, on and off the pod. You're doing awesome stuff, and yeah,
Likewise.
great to be on.
Yeah, I'm
Mhm.
not a threads guy myself, or blue sky. Just fully locked into Seerat's version of X. I'm surprised you're keeping the brand, but you know, hopefully it has legs. It's been an absolute
Yeah,
pleasure
and
to
just that's
talk.
the only thing I have to plug. Just keep an eye on this space, man.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's been a pleasure to talk business acumen, basketball, and
Mhm.
the bleeding edge of Twitter/X, as you call it endearingly. Sarah, thank you. Listeners, thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, we'll see you. Bye bye.